I've known Josh Hammer for almost a decade now. Back when we first met in DC, before his name was splashed across Newsweek or his show was a syndication, he was just a sharp young lawyer who loved Western civilization, a good debate, and telling the truth without apology. We've spent plenty of late nights on the terrace at Morton's in DC, sharing laughs, arguing ideas, and laying out the battles that conservatives had ahead of us. Fast forward to today, and Josh has become one of the most important voices in the movement. As senior editor-at-large at Newsweek, a syndicated columnist and host of The Josh Hammer Show, he's calling out the corruption of our institutions, the erosion of our borders, the assault on the very foundations of the American Republic. He's taken the fight to big tech, which, by the way, when we first started that, no one was involved in that fight, besides us and a few handful of people and Josh Hammer. But he's taken the fight to activist judges and to a political class that would rather manage America's decline than revive her greatness. But what makes Josh different is that he's not just about hot takes. He's about building a serious, coherent vision of what conservatism should be. He's challenging us to go deeper, to defend faith, family, and the Constitution with confidence, and to stop apologizing for loving our country. Josh is a fighter and one of the sharpest minds we've got in this movement. But most importantly, Josh is a true friend. I'm thrilled to have him here with us today. Josh, welcome to the Terry Schilling Show.
Terry, that's actually one of the kindest introductions I think I've ever gotten on a podcast. So thank you very much for that. And it's great to reconnect with you, my friend.
You know, I tend to put a little bit of thought and soul into writing them for each guest. Sometimes I don't really know them, but you're different, right? You're someone that I've known for several years now. And I feel like we've been in enough battles where we're battle tested and there's a special bond from all of that.
For sure. No, we've been fighting for the family, fighting against big tech, just fighting for good old fashioned American values, big porn. I mean, it's been a lot of fun, my friend. And I'm really delighted to reconnect with you. Congratulations as well on the launch of the wonderful show as well.
Well, thank you. It's only successful because of people like you joining and having real Look, it's just me having great conversations with my friends primarily, right? And one of the main reasons, though, that I wanted to get you on the show was because you are a legal expert, you know all things constitutional law, and there's right now this case before the Supreme Court, Chile versus Salazar, which is going to basically determine whether or not these bans on conversion therapy, so-called conversion therapy, really it's talk therapy, you get to talk to children, or whether or not they're constitutional or whether or not they're an infringement on the First Amendment. So I'll unpack this a little bit because I know you deal with a lot of different, you have a very broad palette when it comes to constitutional law, and I'm really in this niche of the family and trans issues. But essentially what the left did over the last 20 years was they started calling talk therapy conversion therapy, and they built hysteria around it. And they've actually gotten 27 states to ban talk therapy. And what talk therapy is in these laws is it's when you sit down with a child who is confused about their gender and you get them to feel comfortable about their body. You get to the heart of why they feel like they might be a boy when they're actually a girl, or vice versa. And, you know, at the heart of it essentially is it's banning the treatment of gender dysphoria as a mental illness. And it forces these therapists to treat gender dysphoria as if it's legitimate, as if it's the reality that these kids should be forcing themselves to live through, even though they obviously have uncomfortability with the gender dysphoria. So I'm wondering, is there any legal precedent behind these laws that would say that they're constitutional, or would a Supreme Court decision ruling these talk therapy bans be ruled, you know, would something upholding these talk therapy bans as constitutional, would that be just like a total like weird thing that they would do?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And first of all, kind of to give away the lead before I get going here, it's actually a legal question, Terry, that given the current composition of the Supreme Court, I'm actually pretty optimistic here because this is a right of center Supreme Court. It's not a far right Supreme Court. I mean, you know, there are really only two justices who can be counted on time and time again in every single case, Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito. But it definitely is a right of center court. Most of the big cases over the past few years, more often than not, come out the correct way. There are some stinkers, some duds, but most of them seem to come out the right way. And on an issue like this, that really is correctly a core, as you frame it, a core First Amendment question, a freedom of speech question, a freedom of association question. By the way, freedom of association, not literally in the First Amendment, but has been implied and assumed and been jurisprudentially held to be part of the First Amendment for literally centuries, for a very long time now there. So based on all that and based on just how strong a First Amendment stance, even some of the more moderate conservative nominees on the Supreme Court take there, this is the kind of case that I personally find myself to be more optimistic on. I guess the legal argument, if I'm trying to steel man, as they say, if I'm trying to steel man what the LGBT lobby's legal argument is for their purported rationale to ban what really, as you say, is talking. I mean, essentially parents talking to children, bringing in a third party intervener. It could be a psychologist, could be a psychiatrist, could be a church leader or a lay leader, whoever it may be. I guess in their attempt to ban these conversations, they would probably be appealing to the state's police power, which is a basic feature of America's constitutional structure, right? I mean, as James Madison famously says in Federalist Number 45, the federal government's powers are few and defined. The state's powers are indefinite and not defined. They are, by the 10th Amendment, essentially held to be vast. And there's a case from the late 19th century called Mugler versus Kansas that really kind of hits home at these state police power, referring to the health, morals, and safety. Those are kind of the police powers where the state has been held to regulate. Now, two things. One is that case about the police powers was really initiated well before the whole Bill of Rights incorporation, which is a legal way of saying that the Bill of Rights were then held to apply not just to the federal government, but to the states. Once upon a time, the First Amendment only applied to if the federal government was allegedly infringing you. But nowadays, for better or for worse, I personally think actually for worse, but nowadays we say that the First Amendment applies also to the state government. So in this case, that actually has a positive ramification for our side of this fight there, because this does strike us as potentially a First Amendment violation. I think the more culturally interesting and less legally nerdy point is that if you look at what the police powers argument is doing here, Terry, they've literally inverted on its head. I mean, back in the day, invoking the police powers on health, morals, and safeties would have been what they would have invoked to justify things like banning sodomy, like criminalizing sodomy, banning abortion. I mean, banning all pornography, blasphemy. I mean, all sorts of things that once upon a time the states would have been well within their powers, universally recognized, to ban. But we have this new left-wing neo-Marxist view of the world, that their view of the health, morals, and safeties is actually, no, you have to affirm that person's sense of gender identity. You have to affirm that person's sexual orientation. So if you really want to have the quote-unquote safety of the individual, you can't even have these conversations. Again, if I'm trying to steel man here, I think that's what they're doing. They're basically making an old-school 19th century police powers moral argument and literally just inverting and flipping the script through this bizarre 21st century left-wing neo-Marxist prism. I don't think it's going to work. I think that our side is likely going to win this case ultimately, Terry.
Well, Josh, what's interesting is you're talking and making this case. I congratulate you on actually doing the best you could to make a steel man. We just got done with Skermetti, where they were arguing the exact opposite, that these types of bans, like sex change procedures for minors, is actually harmful. So which is it? Right. And I think we all know the answer to that. You're getting to the heart of it, which is that this is not about anything besides authoritarianism towards the sexual liberation movement, which we can get into that whole thing. But you have on one side, they don't even want you to be able to talk about things. They don't want you to be able to question. That's at the heart of talk therapy. It's not conversion therapy, because what they're actually banning is conversation. These therapists weren't going in and just changing kids' gender or anything. They were actually getting to the root of the problem, which now what's happening is the exact opposite. Now kids will go in with depression or anxiety, and now the therapists a lot of times will say, oh, you're anxious or you're depressed because you aren't being affirmed in your gender identity. And so now they come out with a whole other diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It's totally crazy when they didn't even go in having any confusion about their gender at all.
Yeah, it's totally right. And you're very keen to pick up on the Skermetti thing, where the scripts were essentially inverted. This separate approach to the state's police powers versus the reach of the Bill of Rights, or the reach really of the 14th Amendment, I think was actually the ACLU's argument in the Skermetti case. But again, they are, I think, making this bizarre police powers argument, but It's not going to work. It's not going to work here because the First Amendment jurisprudence in this area is very, very robust. And the First Amendment jurisprudence, I think, is robust actually in a way that the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause jurisprudence that really was kind of the undergird of the Scrimeti litigation for the side of civilizational arson for the ACLU side. They're really kind of making this strong 14th Amendment argument there. Well, the 14th Amendment is actually a little more complicated. The 14th Amendment is actually one of the most complicated parts of the entire Constitution there. And some cases kind of take a stronger view, some cases take a weaker view there. But this court has really taken a very, very strong First Amendment stance for a very long time. There are actually few things that I think the Roberts Court is stronger on, Terry, than the First Amendment. I struggle to think of a single case, actually, where they have really not taken kind of the strongest possible view of the First Amendment. Again, it's possible this could be the first time there, but I think that is ultimately going to get tossed out. By the way, kind of as a side note, why is it that so many of these LGBT culture war cases seem to come out of Colorado? I mean, we have this case. I mean, obviously we had kind of the masterpiece cake shop, bake the damn cake bigot case there. We had what was the case a couple of terms ago there with the Christian wedding designer there? That was a First Amendment case there. 303 Creative. Yeah, 303 Creative was there. I mean, there are all these kind of high profile culture war cases coming out of Colorado. I lived in Colorado for a year, Terry. I'm kind of happy I got out. It's a beautiful place to visit, but not necessarily sure it's a place I want to live, to be honest.
Well, I don't know. I mean, they were the first state in America to legalize marijuana, and we all know what the effects are of marijuana on brain cells and your cognitive function. So it might have something to do with that. No, but the reality is that Colorado actually was a conservative bulwark against a lot of the left. I mean, they were basically the Texas of the West Coast, and the focus on the family was based out of Colorado. Right. That's where they're in Colorado Springs. And the left actually made a concerted effort. That was their, we see the left trying to turn Texas purple or turn it blue. That was the first Texas that they had. So you had all of these major funders. His last name's Gill. I forget his first name, but he's the guy that said we're going to punish the wicked when it came to the LGBT stuff. But he's a billionaire from Oracle, and he really wanted to punish the left and use Colorado as like a testing ground for all their stuff. So there's been probably billions of dollars pumped in from the left into Colorado to turn it blue. But I want to shift gears a little bit because you don't just focus on these cultural war issues or these LGBT issues. What's got you up at night from the Supreme Court? What are you focused on? Are there any upcoming battles that you think will be hugely impactful to the future of our country?
Sure. Well, Terry, look, more generally speaking, I think from January 2025 until now, you're looking at the most sprawling judicial insurrection, I've called this, since Abraham Lincoln was president. That is literally not an exaggeration. So if there's one thing Article 3 judicial branch related that continues to keep me up at night, even in the aftermath, by the way, of the CASA case where the court severely curtailed the use of these so-called universal nationwide injunctions there, even after that, a lot of these judges, to the extent that they're not just flipping their fingers at the Supreme Court, a lot of them are trying then to grant these massive class actions. They're essentially abusing Rule 23 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure to grant these gargantuan class actions that really kind of have the effect of being a universal injunction. So that, by the way, is going to have to be the next big thing that SCOTUS cracks down on, is the abuse of the class action process. But more generally,
Josh, real quick, can you break that? What was the original? Like, what's the charitable intent of those nationwide injunctions? Like, what was the original purpose of those, that they allow those in the first place?
Sure. So, well, look, if I'm being as charitable as possible, right, then I think, because historically speaking, there was no such thing as a so-called nationwide injunction, Terry. There was no such thing as an ability of a lower court judge to bind the whole country. Literally, the first instance of a judge trying to do this in the entire history of America was in the 1960s. I think it was in the Lyndon Johnson presidency. The Donald Trump first term from 2017 and 2021 ends up having more of these so-called nationwide injunctions than the first 44 presidents combined. Wow. So it's very hard for me to be charitable. But in theory, if I'm trying to be charitable, I think what they're trying to say here is we just want rules of uniformity, the same rules here, so that you don't have like kind of litigation parlor or sweepstakes there where you pick your judges. Unfortunately for those folks, that literally is our system. Like that actually is the system the founders gave us. If you object to it, you're entitled to object to try to amend the Constitution, because the judicial power of which Article 3 speaks does not entail or encompass the ability for a lower court judge to just bind the entire body politic. I would actually go even further and say that the judicial power does not give the Supreme Court the ability to bind the entire body politic. That was certainly the stance of Abraham Lincoln, who, in his first inaugural address in 1861, famously said that if we were to give this Roger Taney Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott case, if we were to give them the ability to bind the entire country, then we will cease to be our own rulers. We will then be giving into judicial despotism there. So that's my own stance there. But at a bare minimum, it's ludicrous to suggest that these lower court judges have that ability. And that's what the Supreme Court then said in this CASA case, which is that case in late June where Amy Coney Barrett comes out with really fiery language against Ketanji Brown Jackson. I was really quite happy to see that. Again, some judges are trying to get around this with this class action stuff. That's going to be the next judicial frontier to fight. So yeah, what's keeping me up at night? It's the judicial insurrection, which really above all, Terry, focuses on the immigration issue, right? That's kind of been the number one area of litigation, I think, for the Trump administration. I have a very, very simple view of immigration law. There is something the constitutional lawyers refer to as the plenary power doctrine. Plenary just meaning absolute power. What it means is that since time immemorial, the two political branches, Article 1, the Congress, Article 2, the executive branch, have plenary, that's say absolute power when it comes to enforcing this nation's immigration laws. The very, very first time, this is an amazing stat I'm going to say, the very first time that the U.S. Supreme Court ever held a provision of immigration law to be unconstitutional was in 2018. 2018 in the Sessions versus DiMaia case. It was actually one of the first cases where Justice Gorsuch went a little wobbly, actually. But prior to that, the court had never attempted to kind of thumb its nose at the political branches, because they understood that the immigration and who is here, who constitutes the polity, is the very core of a political question over which unelected judges really have no say. So to see all these judges kind of just weighing in, trying to, Boasberg trying to turn around the plane that's halfway to Guatemala or El Salvador, or wherever it was going there. Palpably insane. Truly, truly cringe, impeachable, offense-worthy behavior there. So that, above all, is really what's keeping me up at night there. But look, the Trump administration is fighting, and hopefully those efforts only get louder and more vociferous from there.
Well, you're exactly right, though. The courts cannot be tasked with enforcing immigration laws. It has to be, look, I would prefer the president just in charge. And if you don't like the numbers that he's putting in, then you have to, Congress can rein them in. But at a minimum, it's a national security threat. Like, who is being allowed to come into the country and enter is a commander-in-chief type designation, right? The chief enforcement officer. It has to be the president. You can't leave this to the courts because they're way too soft, and they will never be held accountable by the people. They can't be held accountable. They're separated from the people for the most part. But it has to be the president. The president has to be in charge of immigration. Otherwise, no one's going to be accountable for who gets brought in here and all the devastation and damage that gets done. Yeah,
look, I care immensely, Terry, about kind of our core cultural cases, LGBT, abortion, all that stuff. I really do. But to me, I've actually always said that there's probably no more important issue for the United States of America as a whole than immigration, because immigration really is the one issue that actually affects literally everything. It affects the economy. It affects labor, jobs, wages. It clearly affects, as you correctly say, national security. It affects crime. And most importantly, it affects the most important question in literally all of politics, going back to Aristotle, going back to the Bible, to the most ancient political sources, which is, who are we? Like, what is the nature of the polity, the polis, Aristotle would have called it, right? Like literally, who are we? Like, what is our identity? What is our culture? What do we have a shared language? Do we have shared customs there? And you have to maintain some sense of uniformity of culture. Again, previous generations of Americans, this would not have even... no one would have even thought twice about this. When my ancestors came to this country, they were Ashkenazi Jews who came here during the Ellis Island immigration wave, late 1800s, early 1900s. This was not even a question. Like, obviously, you come here, you learn English, you become a patriotic American, you learn the way of the American people, and you assimilate into the majority culture. Now, it's okay to an extent, certainly, to have minority cultures, minority religions. That's obviously okay. But you have to, at a certain level, assimilate into the majority culture. And That's just not happening in America today. There, I mean, you can drive through Dearborn, Michigan. It's basically one big Hezbollah cell.
Well, I don't think Islam can assimilate to America. It's diametrically opposed to America. It's like communism can't assimilate to America. One of those things is going to win. Either you're going to become an American or you're going to become a communist. Like these things don't mix. They're oil and water.
Yeah, that's basically my stance too, right? Now, on the one hand, it's true that individual Muslims, of course, can assimilate there. Dr. Judy Jasser, a good friend of mine now in Arizona, Abe Hamda in Congress. I mean, there obviously are examples, but yes, talking here not just dispensations, but kind of just in terms of categories. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that Islam is broadly speaking incompatible with the Judeo-Christian and biblical West. And again, previous generations of Americans, Terry, this is pretty clear. I mean, we could talk about what the American founders said about various religions, but they had some pretty harsh words, let's say, to talk about Mohammedism, as they typically called it. And, you go back even, around the time as well. After the Revolutionary War, America's first two wars, people kind of oftentimes jump from the Revolutionary War to the War of 1812, at least when I learned history in middle school and high school, that's how I was taught it. But you kind of jump over the two Barbary Wars. I mean, America's really first two wars after the Revolutionary War were the first and second Barbary Wars, literally against Muslim pirates off the coast of Algeria and Tunisia and Libya. In fact, that is the reason, Terry, literally the first and second Barbary Wars, that is the reason that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison really made the U.S. Navy a thing. Prior to that, there had not been a massive U.S. Navy. We didn't really need it, honestly. We were fighting a home war against the British.
I just say, I do think it was funny that when Trump, drone struck those drug cartel guys in the ocean, you had all these left-wing pundits on MSNBC saying, this is unprecedented. It's like, no, like this basically, but how you put it, this happened since the beginning of the country, by the way. Jefferson, like one of the authors of this country, like was the first guy to do it. But how you just described it, like they developed the U.S. Navy because of this. Like, so Trump just used what we already had. He didn't develop any new technology. But anyway, sorry, go on. You just made a good point that made me think.
Yeah, for sure. No, and there's two things to say on that, actually. So sticking with Islam on the one hand, then I'll go back to what you just said. Look, I mean, this notion that Islam is in serious tension, if not outright incompatible with the West, goes back way further than the Barbary Wars, obviously. I mean, talk about the siege of Vienna, in the late 1600s. I mean, when the invading Ottomans got all the way into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, into Vienna there, that was a huge victory for Christian Europe to repel the Muslim invaders at that time there. I mean, the Crusades, hello. I mean, like the Crusades were this whole big series of wars between Christians and Muslims. So this notion that Islam at best is compatible with the West, or perhaps taking it further, there are some out there, Terry, who make this argument that Muslims are Christians' natural allies, and kind of the wink, wink, nudge, nudge is oftentimes that the Jews are not their allies there. I mean, it's really, really fundamentally backwards, in many ways historically illiterate stuff. But the drug cartel thing that you brought up is actually interesting as well, because I've seen a lot of folks kind of out there, because our foreign policy debates are so complicated these days, a lot of emotions. A lot of people say, oh, the founding fathers were isolationists. I'm not sure that's true. They definitely were not, swashbuckling neoconservatives. I mean, George Washington's farewell address.
They wanted to trade with the world, though. They didn't want. They wanted to open trade. Like they knew how important trade. Anyway, sorry, go on. I'm ruining your good points.
No, you're definitely not ruining it. And that's also more complicated, right? They believed in trade. They also believed in industrial policy. I mean, Alexander Hamilton's tariff system there was kind of the basis of the American economic engine for much of the 19th century. Henry Clay, the great statesman from Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln, by the way, Abraham Lincoln was a great admirer of Henry Clay and of Alexander Hamilton. They were big proponents of industrial policy, strategic totariffs, but they were not such hardcore economic nationalists that they disagree with the entire notion of bilateral trade deals, right? So that's totally accurate as well. But when it comes to foreign policy, George Washington spoke in his farewell address in 1796. Yes, he absolutely said, beware of foreign entanglements there. But he's talking about being aware of the notion of permanent entanglements there. Don't get bogged down forever. The notion that America was ever supposed to just bury its head in the sand and just have nothing to do with the world is preposterous, frankly. And there's very little of that tradition in the writings of the American founders. There's very little, frankly, in that tradition at all for the first 100 years, give or take, of the American Republic's existence. If anything, James Monroe, who famously kind of theorized the Monroe Doctrine,
Yeah.
right? I mean, he actually explicitly advocated for a foreign policy. His foreign policy was just focused on the Western Hemisphere there, but the notion that our interests would stop literally at our borders is farcical and just historically literate.
All right. You have a unique term that you've come up with to describe your viewpoints when it comes to the Constitution, and it's common good originalism. Can you unpack that? What is that, and how, how does that impact the world we have in America today?
Sure. So, come to originalism. Terry, I started developing this around 2020, 2021, give or take. My friend Adrian Vermeule had first proposed his theory of common good constitutionalism, which is kind of my play on his term. I was essentially trying to split the baby, see if I could come up with a theoretical framework for trying to incorporate a lot of these moralistic concepts within kind of the broader nomenclature and vernacular, so to speak, of originalism. My basic intention, Terry, when I talk about common good originalism, my basic argument is that originalists, constitutional conservatives who call themselves originalists, have oftentimes taken originalism in an overly black letter, legalistic, positivistic direction. And not to pick on Anthony Scalia because he was a wonderful man. I actually named my Colt 45 revolver after him. It literally says Scalia in the wooden barrel of the gun. So I have a great admiration for him. But he did take this hardcore. The four corners of the page is really the end all be all of my interpretive job approach. He used to famously spar with Harry Jaffa of the Clarence suit on this very question. Jaffa would say, what about the Declaration of Independence? And Scalia would say, well, it's not part of the Constitution, therefore I don't really care about it. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, that's essentially what he would say there. And my contention is that this sentiment taken to its logical conclusion, where you ignore the overarching context, where you ignore what Hamilton refers to in Federalist 31 as the anchoring truths, the anchoring principles upon which all subsequent logical reasoning depends. When you ignore all of that, my argument is that you get to places like the Bostock case, frankly, like the Bostock case of 2020, where Justice Gorsuch, admittedly, that's a statutory case, not a constitutional case, but it's similar for our purposes, but where it gets to a place where you can look at something that says discrimination because of sex and basically say, okay, that actually means discrimination because of sexual orientation, gender identity, even though gender identity was literally not a thing, as the kids say, back when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. So you have to consider the anchoring truth. You have to consider the overarching context there. And my claim specifically in common good originalism, yeah, I mentioned Aristotle earlier in our conversation. Aristotle, among the concepts that he was big on was this notion of telos. The telos is essentially the overarching orientation. What is the substantive overarching orientation of a political regime, of a legal regime, the constitutional order? And my argument is that the telos of the American regime is located in the preamble of the Constitution, even more so than the Declaration. The preamble is literally on its own terms that they are telling us why they are doing this. They're literally saying, in order to do XYZ things, we are writing this Constitution. And those XYZ things, if you actually read them, they're not very libertarian. They're very communitarian. They're very common good, dare I say, even nationalist. These are things like the general welfare, domestic tranquility, public defense, and so forth there. So my basic argument is that when you're interpreting some of these vaguer constitutional phrases or even statutory phrases there, you should do so through that interpretive prism. You should reject the excesses of libertarianism run amok and hardcore radical individualism and put a thumb on the scale, if need be, of this communitarian sentiment of the common good. That's my basic argument, and was written as something of a reproach to decades of positivistic originalism. Terry, I first started writing this stuff 5.5 years ago now, and we're still talking about it. I guess it's here to stay, which I'm pretty happy to say.
Well, we just got to figure out a pathway to get you in the pipeline to get onto the Supreme Court, or at least like in the federal judiciary, because I think it'd be a lot better country if we had more common good originalism.
I agree with that. Unfortunately, my friend, I am beyond unconfirmable, but I appreciate the sentiment.
Um, so obviously that is totally contrasted with libertarianism and obviously left-wing judicial activism. How would that apply to today's cases, like Skermetti, like this upcoming Childs versus Salazar? Like how would that all play out?
Sure. So Skermetti is actually a fantastic example, right? So Skermetti, they were basically trying to make an equal protection clause argument that the equal protection clause somehow precludes laws proscribing genital mutilation there. Okay. But the common good, like a substantive notion of the common good, is obviously not in any way whatsoever served by this argument that there is an affirmative constitutional right to literally mutilate and murder your body. What I argue in the longer form version of my first article for the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy back in 2021 is that if you look at American constitutionalism, Terry, it's really downstream of the English common law. And many of America's great jurists said this. Justice Joseph Story said actually that, I think it was Story, famously said that the English common law is actually just part of the American law. And to this day, 49 of the 50 states, the exception being Louisiana, which is a little quirky, but all the other states actually have the common law codified at the state level. So the question then arises, what were the English common lawyers doing there? Well, they were really, above all, they were basing their judgments on scripture, on the Bible itself. So when I talk about the common good in a jurisprudential context there, I'm really talking about principles of substantive justice that are ultimately downstream of nothing less than the actual Bible itself. So taking us back then to the Scrimeti case there, what is the actual argument? The actual argument is that there was an equal protection clause argument to literally mutilate your body and to pretend that a he can be a she or a she can be a he. But the notion that there is a substantive or legalistic right to mutilate your body to pretend that a he is a she or a she is a he flies in the face of one of the most rudimentary principles in the entire Bible. I mean, Genesis 1:27, the notion that man is made in God's image, male and female, he created them. Now, look, I'm not necessarily saying that a Scrimeti judge has to go down that road of citing scripture. I happen to think it's actually a pretty good idea. I very much like it, actually, when judges cite scripture. There was this case out of Alabama about a year and a half ago, the IVF case, where there was a concurring opinion by one of the justices who was just citing scripture repeatedly. And I had some friends who were like, oh my God, or not really friends, but frenemies on the left who were saying, oh my God, what is he doing there? This is like a Christo-fascist country, whatever, like that. And I was like, no, it's not. This is literally America, dude. Like they're literally
they're telling us something, Josh, because human rights, the entire concept is biblical, right? Like the whole reason why we as human beings have human rights is because they come from our Creator. And that came from the Bible. It didn't come from the Quran. It didn't come from any of these other alternative. It certainly didn't come from human secularism. It is all biblically based. And so when they start attacking Christianity and everything in the Bible, it's totally nuts. It is totally crazy. You are actually telling us that you want to get rid of human rights and that you want to replace it with something else, which I think we see where it's heading. It's heading to androgyny. It's heading to more abortions. It's heading to more death, more sexual assaults. Like all of this world, all of Western civilization in America, by that end, we're built on Western cultural values, and which is based on the Bible primarily.
100%. And Terry, this is the argument that I make in my book, by the way, that came out in March: Israel and Civilization, the Fate of the Jewish Nation, the Destiny of the West. I mean, what you just said is really the core of that book. The title of the book is actually a little misleading. Israel is kind of a double entendre. They're referring not just to the state, but also to the Jewish people. So the broader argument in the book really, again, is what is the West? I mean, like, what is Western civilization? And, the classic Straussian formulation, Leo Strauss of the University of Chicago, spiritual godfather of the Claremont Institute, among others, famously said that Western civilization is this DNA-like strand, this double helix of interweaving parts of reason and revelation, where reason is from Greece and Rome, revelation is from Jerusalem, the Bible, Scripture, etc. And I don't object to that, Terry, but I do think that the reason side has had an unduly large thumb on the scale. My reading of the West is actually much more heavily in favor of revelation over reason. I think the American founders, by the way, they were very familiar with the Greeks, the Romans. They were definitely fans in many ways of Aristotle, Cicero. They were much bigger fans, frankly, of the Bible. I mean, there's a reason that Leviticus is inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, not Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or Cicero's speech from the floor of the Roman Senate there. There's a reason that Benjamin Franklin wanted the national seal of the United States to be Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. There's a reason that Abraham Lincoln referred to America as an almost chosen people, as opposed to some similar, phrase from Aristotle or Plato's writings there. And America really was founded to be a beacon of Western civilization, what Reagan referred to as that shining city on a hill, going back to the similar phrase used from John Winthrop in Massachusetts in the early 17th century, referring, of course, originally to Jerusalem. That's what the shining on the city hill is in the actual scripture. So this really is the crux of Western civilization. This definitely is the crux of America. And if anything, and I don't want to ramble too much on this because I don't want to take our valuable time, but if you go too far down this rabbit hole, Terry, of exalting reason and reason above all, you can get to some pretty absurd cases. Again, I'm not saying that reason has no role to play there, but it'd be very easy for Chase Strangio, the lawyer for the ACLU in Scrimeti, to say it is reasonable for someone to chop off his weenie because he thinks that he is female. Reason only works when you have something else to tether it to. You have to have a starting place. Reason cannot be the starting place, okay? If you have a starting place, fine. You can then reach secondary or tertiary.
There has to be some logical formula.
Yes. You have to start with something exogenous, something different. Then reason you can use to like logically deduce secondary or tertiary conclusions there. But if you're just starting out from scratch there, ex nihilo, if you are starting out from total scratch, you're done. I mean, that's how, not to exaggerate too much there, but that's basically how you get to things like communism and fascism. I mean, the communists thought they were acting reasonably. The Nazis thought they were acting reasonably. These are not regimes that thought they were acting in evil fashion. They thought they were acting reasonably, but they lacked the Bible. They lacked scripture. They lacked God fundamentally there. And that really is why they went off the rails so quickly.
Well, I want to get into winning and the path forward, because I think those are the most important questions. How do we win? What do we have to win at? My fear, Josh, is, America is a continuation of Western civilization. You had the Jews in Israel, you had the Greeks, you had the Romans, you had Britain. My fear, though, is that, with the Roman Empire, for example, it was a pagan empire that basically dominated the world, but it became Christian. And it ended up expanding these human rights all throughout the globe. And it ended up leading to the creation of America. I look at America, if we lose here, I could see America becoming the anti-Roman Empire, where it starts off as an anti-pagan nation, as a Christian nation that's advancing human rights. And then when it falls, it actually introduces something I would call paganism 2.0, right? Which is like a new form of paganism that's, I think the original pagans, and I'm gonna butcher. I can't remember the guy. I read this new article a few years ago. It's very old, and I'm totally blanking on the author's name. But it was about the new paganism and how the original paganism was ignorance. They didn't know anything better, so they just went to all these pagan practices, and they were hedonists, and they practiced license, quite frankly. But today, that if the paganism was to be reintroduced, it would be coercive. Like we're seeing in these states, you are forced to affirm a child's transgender identity in school. Otherwise, you lose your job. What's the path forward? What do we need to win at, and how do we do that?
Yeah, I think I recall that article actually. It was written, I believe, by my friend Leo Leibovitz about the new paganism. What great guy, wonderful article, very sharp writer. Definitely recommend this to all the viewers. And you're asking the right question. I mean, what does winning look like there? You're totally right that this is a new paganism. You're totally right, moreover, that they have a win at all costs mentality.
Hilaire Belloc, that's what. Anyway, go on. Sorry.
Okay, well, Leo wrote a very similar essay for Commentary Magazine 2 or 3 years ago. Anyway, I'm sure they're both great essays. But this broader notion that you're getting at there is that the left has an insatiable appetite not merely for winning, but for getting the spoils and then just kind of rubbing it in the loser's face. I think back to Eric Erickson's line from a very long time ago, back when Eric was still the editor of Red States. He had this blog post around the time, not of the Obergefell litigation, but the Windsor litigation. People forget about Windsor. Windsor was the same-sex marriage case 2 years prior to Obergefell. It was 2013. That's when they declared the Marriage Act from the 1990s, the DOMA, Defense of Marriage Act, to be unconstitutional, which is ludicrous. I mean, Clinton signed it. Neither here nor there. Anyway, what Erickson wrote at the time was, "You will be made to care." And it's a line that always stuck with me after all these years, because it's just true. Right? Like that literally is the left's mentality. Is they have no interest in John Stuart Mill live and let live liberalism. Maybe the old liberals of the 1950s, 1960s did, but certainly this modern incarnation of liberal or progressive, whatever you want to call it. We can debate exactly when it started. It really starts in the American Academy with the rise of the Frankfurt School in the late 60s. Politically speaking, it's really predominantly a post Barack Obama, post 2008 manifestation there. But Terry, I mean, I don't have to tell you, these people have zero interest in compromising with people like me and people like you. They want to fundamentally subjugate and, or in many ways, I don't think it's exaggeration to say, eliminate our way of life. I'm not saying that they want to kill all of us. They definitely do want to kill some of us. I mean, I think we've seen that all too vividly, frankly.
Well, they celebrated Charlie Kirk's murder. I mean,
exactly.
They would celebrate our murders too.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's totally correct, by the way. But even holding that aside, they at a bare minimum, definitely want to get rid of our way. I have no doubt that they think that Orthodox Judaism, traditional Catholicism, evangelical Protestantism, I have no doubt that they think these are just troglodyte, like horrific stains on America, and they would get rid of it overnight. So the notion that they will ever carve out some sort of space, you know, for us to live our lives is totally foolish. And by the way, they're showing that not just with rifles and the assassination attempts, which they're doing that as well there, but they're doing it through among other things, lawfare. I mean, look at the Biden administration, not just prosecuting former President Donald J. Trump. How about the FACE Act litigation when it comes to the pro-life grannies there? Obviously, the infamous Merrick Garland critical race theory memo for domestic terrorism back in the fall of 2021, 4 years ago now. They're doing everything they can to eliminate our viewpoints and our way of life. So we have no choice but to fight back. Literally no choice. I'm not saying that you go, you know, that you ignore the rule of law and you start governing like a straw man, but within the confines of the rule of law, it is incumbent upon all of us. It is our imperative to use all of the tools at our disposal: litigation, executive power, Supreme Court cases, jurisprudence. That's where come good originalism comes in. All of the above, the market, the tax code, all of these various other intermediaries and these meeting institutions all have to be oriented towards the express promotion of good and the express punishment of the wicked or evil, which, by the way, I think is the biblical mentality. The Bible says repeatedly that you have an ability to promote justice and virtue and the good and to end evil and suffering and harm. So it is now incumbent upon us to actually take what our friend Hadley Arkes might call that value judgment and actually implement it, and actually try to use that when it comes to, let's try to subsidize, you know, churches and synagogues. Let's try to subsidize family formation, child tax credit. Let's try to subsidize good things and try to actively stamp out via the tax code and disincentives and so forth bad things. That is what is called for now. At some point, Terry, hopefully they will get the message there. I happen to like where some of the lawfare stuff is headed at this time. The Jim Comey indictments, I think, a nice kind of small step back.
No one's above the law, right? No one's above the law.
No one's above the law, because ultimately, Terry, as I say, as I've heard others say, the only way out is through. There is no way other than through. We are in this mess. It is definitely a mess, but we're going to win it. And we're going to win it by, among other things, trying to punch back so hard in the short term to try to make sure we have a sustainable, viable mid to long term equilibrium.
Well, I think a lot of the reasons why we saw the left just go totally crazy and weaponize the government against conservatives and against Trump was because the Republican Party that they've been dealing with from the Bush era and the McCain era and the Mitt Romney era was so weak and effete. I mean, there was no way they would ever use government against their political opponents, so they thought we'd get away with it.
Right.
And I always go back. Someone told me years ago this dynamic where the left preaches tolerance when they're out of power. Right. But once they get it, that's where they switch to coercion. And that's exactly what we've seen. And now they're even doing that. Now I think they're just blowing up. I think that they're a rudderless party. I think that they really lack leadership, and now it's decentralized, but they've radicalized their base. They've made all of these crazy psychopaths who think that political assassinations are totally good, totally normal.
You know, not to put too fine a point on it, but this normalization of violence to the point of literally murdering people. This is literally how republics die. I mean, there are various ways republics die. I think you're right that the threat of taking from a biblical country to a neo-pagan country is another slower way that the country could absolutely unequivocally die. But, you know, we talked a lot here about the Constitution, the American founding. You know, there's a famous anecdote about Benjamin Franklin leaving Independence Hall, leaving the Constitutional Convention. This local doctor in Philadelphia who says, "Mr. Franklin, what is it that you wise men have given us? You've been sweating away here for this very hot summer in Philadelphia." And Franklin looks to the doctor and says, "Doctor, it is a republic if you can keep it." And this is how you don't keep it, is when you decide, as many on the left have decided, that speech is equivalent to violence, and therefore the response to speech is not more speech, but violence. Okay? If you actually think that, if you literally take that to its conclusion, then we cease to be a people that will decide our differences at the ballot box, through the pen, the keyboard, the mouth, and so forth. And at that point, when you decide that we are a people that are going to decide our differences through knives and bullets and rifles and assassinations, then we really cease to be human in any meaningful sense of the term. You're really at that point no different than the animals, and you're not going to keep a country at that point. You literally just cannot keep a self-governing country. At that point, you're on a very, very, very quick, rapid path towards some sort of tyranny, to some sort of dictatorship, which frankly would probably be necessary at that point just for the sake of just restoring order of monarchy. So it's really, 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 really dangerous stuff. And I just pray, Terry, that there's at least one person on the left who is willing to kind of have some grand 36-minute speech to like really, really, really try to call that side to account. I think the only person who maybe still has that kind of crossover appeal from the establishment to the left-wing activists would be Barack Obama. But I see very little indication, Terry, that he's
he wants to ramp it up. He wants to ramp it up.
Exactly.
Josh, closing thoughts. What's coming up in the next few years? I know you've gone over what's keeping you up at night, but just what do you want to leave the audience with? And then also I want to promote where people can find you, because I do think, and I'm not just saying this because you're a friend, I do think you're one of the brightest legal minds in America today. So tell us where we go from here as closing thoughts, and then where people can find you.
Yeah, sure, you bet. So look, there's been some pessimistic things said in this conversation, right? I mean, various ways that a republic can unravel. Look, I hate to leave on a bad note. I mean, the good guys are in charge right now. The good guys are literally in charge right now. And there's been a lot of winning so far. There's really been a lot of winning. I mean, it was very, very recently that I saw that Harmeet Dillon launched a FACE Act lawsuit from the DOJ Civil Rights Division that is not against pro-life grandmothers at abortion clinics, but is actually a FACE Act litigation that is used to do its actual purpose of protecting house of worship. I think in that case it was synagogue. So look, seemingly every day there is great stuff coming out of this administration. I mean, talk about the world stage. Foreign policy from this administration, all the various peace deals they've signed. I mean, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Terry, I was in Armenia 2 years ago. I mean, that's a hot conflict. I mean, no one's talking about that. I mean, the fact that he got a peace deal there is incredible. I mean, to have the leaders of those two countries sitting there, kind of clanking their glasses. I mean, truly like transformative stuff. I mean, then India and Pakistan, Thailand, Cambodia. The foreign policy has been great. They're working really, really hard on the immigration front. I mean, the judges are really trying to go at the worst, but overall, border crossings have absolutely positively plummeted. They're literally down over 90% since the peak of the Biden administration there. So doing great work on that front. The Supreme Court continues to deliver many, many victories. I think there's many good things coming up as well. We didn't even talk about this interesting case coming up that could overturn this New Deal era case called Humphrey's Executor. It would basically be a huge win for Article 2 executive branch power, consolidate hiring decisions. Really great stuff. So there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic there. So let's keep our pedal to the metal. I mean, let's keep our eye on the prize there and really try to take advantage of these next 3.5 years, because this is a remarkable administration thus far. And overall, Terry, despite what we've said from a pessimistic perspective, I'm actually very happy about what I've seen. As far as where you can find me, I'm on X, Josh_Hammer. My syndicated column goes up at Newsweek, Real Clear Politics, Daily Signal, Daily Caller, Los Angeles Times, actually, these days. My show, The Josh Hammer Show, everywhere podcasts are available. My book, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. And for legal purposes, I'm also senior counsel at the Article 3 Project alongside my good friend Mike Davis. You can find us at article3project.org.
Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us. And that has been another episode of The Terry Schilling Show. I'm your host, Terry Schilling, president of American Principles Project, where we seek to make the family the most powerful and important special interest group in the country. Thank you guys so much for joining, and we'll see you next week.